CHAD was an acronym. It would stand for Chad's Having Awesome Days, because this Chad was here for a good time, not a long time. He was a warmongering, lusting lord that loved to party just as hard as he waged war. In this episode of Chads of History, we delve into the life of yet another Chadly Chad known as Alexander the Great. Born in 356 BC in Pella, Macedonia, of King Philip II and a lady named Olympias, who was the daughter of the king of Epirus at the time, in Alexander's teen years he was mentored by Aristotle himself. Though not a Chad, could help Alexander in the teachings of philosophy, medicine, and science. Yes, I said science, even in the 4th century BC. Well, while Philip led an army to attack Asia Minor, he left Alexander in charge around 340 BC. He then got into it with a bunch of Thracians. 2 years later, he helped his father beat the allied Greek states and managed to even break the Sacred Band of Thebes, which is an elite regiment made up of 150 pairs of lovers. Alright, so skip forward to 336 BC, and King Philip has just been assassinated, and Alexander is the new king of Macedon. He then immediately executed the princes of Lyncestis, which were thought to be the people responsible for Philip's murder. He is now marching south to Thessaly to meet with the Greek assembly called the League of Corinth, and was promoted to Generalissimo to basically continue where his father left off invading Asia Minor. So now he's in Thrace in spring of 335 BC, and he has just beaten the Triballi, which is just a group of Thracian people. He then continued on to kick the piss out of the coalition of Illyrians who had invaded Macedonia previously. Well, while he's been gone, somebody in Thebes has begun to circulate a rumor that Alexander had died, and this sparked a revolt. So Alexander marched back to Thebes, to which they refused to surrender, and his answer to that was to raze the city. On the bright side, he spared the temples and the house of some guy named Pindar. This resulted in about 6,000 casualties, but after witnessing this, the rest of Greece were kind of shook, as they didn't expect this level of brutality from Alexander. Alright, so now Alexander is in a position where he needs to pay the army his dad just built up. So what better way to do this other than invading Persia? And that's exactly what he did. In spring of 334 BC, he crossed the Dardanelles with about 35,000 soldiers consisting of footmen and cavalry, for which at the time period was genius for the variety of arms, considering people were still slinging rocks at each other. After visiting Ilium, or what used to be Troy, Alexander finally ran into his first Persian army being led by 3 satraps. A satrap is a fancy way of saying provincial governor. It was at Granicus River the Persians planned to force Alexander to cross the river and then beat him off from there. I mean, kill him off. Well, they almost succeeded until the Persian main line began to waver and eventually broke, giving Alexander his first victory over the Persians. Alexander, being a bit of a dick too, took back 2,000 survivors as volunteers. So now, Western Asia Minor was under Macedonian control, with democracies being installed to replace Persian politics. Alright, so there's this Greek city in Western Anatolia called Miletus, and they didn't want Macedonians raiding and pillaging their lands, so they resisted Alexander with the help of a nearby Persian fleet, to which Alexander kicked their asses while essentially waiting for the Persian fleet to land, as he had intended to take all the coastal cities so they couldn't land without a direct confrontation with Macedonians. Alright, so now it's winter of 334 to 333 BC, and Alexander has taken Western Asia Minor, and he is at Gordium, where there's this stupid, superstitious tale that if you can unravel the Gordian knot, which is some big-ass knot, but if you can unravel the knot, you were meant to rule Asia. This is kinda like pulling the fake sword out of the stone at Disney World. You weren't meant to pull it out conventionally. So being a Chad, Alexander cheated and cut the knot with his sword. So he pressed on to Ancyra and then Cilicia, where he got a fever. In the meantime, Darius III, king of Persia, had been marching northward to Mount Amanus. Well, apparently both sides' spies and intelligence at the time had both up where the opposing army was located, and after some troubleshooting, Alexander found Darius' army along the Pinarus River. This kicked off the Battle of Issus, to which the Macedonian phalanxes and cavalry decisively crushed the Persians. So then, Darius had retreated the area, effectively leaving his family in the clutches of Alexander. But hey, at least the women were treated nicely. So then Alexander continued to Syria and Phoenicia, with his mission to cut off the Persian fleet from its coastal cities and bases, and then kick its ass in a conventional battle. Marathus and Aratus surrendered to Alexander without a fight. A Macedonian general named Parmenio was sent to Damascus to secure its abundance of booty, including Darius's personal treasure chest. So after this, Darius sent Alexander a letter begging for peace, to which Alexander told him to get bent because of how many times the Persians messed with the Greeks in the past, and he wanted an unconditional surrender on Darius's behalf. So that didn't happen, and Alex went to a city called Tyre and got pissed off because they wouldn't let him in. So he did the rational thing and besieged it, for 7 months exactly. Meanwhile, the Persians were attacking the newly captured Macedonian territory in Asia Minor, but then got repelled by Antigonus, who was another Macedonian general at the time. So Darius had sent another offer to pay out the sum of 10,000 talents to ransom back his family, and he would surrender all his lands west of the Euphrates, to which I think they accepted the deal. Then, back in Tyre, Alexander is storming the city, and slaughter ensued. He then proceeded south until he reached Gaza, where he met serious resistance, and hurt a shoulder in the process. In November 332 BC, he reached Egypt, where the people greeted him with open arms, and the Persian satrap had surrendered. Alexander even got a fancy double crown after that. Then, being a Chad hell-bent on leaving his mark upon the world, established a city named after himself, called Alexandria, near the Nile River. So now, in spring of 331 BC, he returned to Tyre and installed a Macedonian satrap for Syria, and then prepared to march into Mesopotamia. Now, in July of 331 BC, Alexander was at Thapsacus, near the Euphrates River, and headed towards the Tigris. Darius had gotten wind of this and marched to the Tigris to avenge himself for his humiliating defeat from before. So now, at the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander finds himself outnumbered by the Persians, but using his javelin throwers, archers, and cavalry attacking the flanks of the Persian lines, Alexander crushed the Persians once again. So then, Alexander chased the beaten Persians for a while, about 35 miles, but Darius managed to escape to Media. So now Alexander controls Babylon, the city, and the province. Susa, the Persian capital, had surrendered, giving up their riches to Alexander as well. He then went on to kick the shit out of a mountain tribe called the Uxians until he got to a city called Persepolis, where he burned down the palace of Xerxes. Xerxes is some other guy that might get his own video, but he is most known for his gigantic invasion of Greece around 480 BC. If you've seen the movie 300, that's basically an accurate depiction of how it went. Alright, so after giving the middle finger to Xerxes' temple, Alexander went on to northern Media and took its capital around 330 BC. So now, after letting the Persians govern themselves with Macedonians in charge, Alexander is beginning to adjust to Persian culture, and this scared his own people. In summer of 330 BC, Alexander had learned that this guy named Bessus had murdered Darius and took over his position, which apparently, after a battle, Bessus had Darius stabbed and then left him to die, which is kind of Alright, so now he continued his campaign eastward into Central Asia. He then took Zadrakarta in Hyrcania. He then beat up another group of mountain people called the Mardi. Then, the Greek mercenaries who had kissed Darius's left butt cheek from before had surrendered to Alexandria. Then at Freda in Drangiana, he destroyed Parmenio and his family after Parmenio's son had become the perpetrator of an alleged assassination plot against Alexander. So this made Alexander's critics scared shitless. He then reorganized the companion cavalry to having 2 sections commanded by his old friend Hephaestion and some other guy named Cletus. Alright, so now the guy that killed Darius was stirring the shit pot in Bactria and started a national revolt. But then, when Alexander brought his army to squash it, Bessus ran away. He then sent one of his generals named Ptolemy to chase after Bessus. But before he could get to him, Bessus was overthrown, beaten, flogged, mutilated, and ultimately executed publicly. Now, at the edge of the Persian Empire, Alexander kicked the shit out of some Scythian nomads who were probably just looking for somewhere to live, and then proceeded to found another city named Alexandria. Then, the people who overthrew Bessus, the Spidamenes, had begun a huge revolt, and in autumn of 328 BC, Alexander beat them too. He then beat up this guy named Oxyartes, and then married his captured daughter. So now, Alex is in Maracanda, where he murdered old Cletus in a drunken argument which pissed off many of his own people, but then was forgiven, and the army eventually convicted Cletus of treason to basically vindicate Alexander. So then Alexander had begun dressing in Persian royal dresses. He began trying to impose some new Persian ceremonial act where you bow down and whatnot, and to the Greeks and Macedonians, they saw this as an intolerable act to a human being. But then, this was shortly curtailed after Alexander's fellow Macedonians had made fun of him for it. So he stopped. But then had this historian, who was the nephew to Aristotle, executed for being privy to a conspiracy. So now, it's 327 BC, and Alexander left Bactria to invade India. He recrossed the Hindu Kush until he got to Aornos, which was a natural stronghold held by the Indians. It was thought to be impregnable, until he used his catapults on them. Then he got to Taxila, where the leaders traded elephants and soldiers in return to help him kick the piss out of his rival, Porus. So then, he and Taxiles beat Porus, and Alexander founded another city named Alexandria, and another city named after his dead horse, Bucephala. And then, for some reason, Porus became his ally. So Alexander wanted to go further beyond the Hyphasis, but his men had basically mutinied and refused to go any further because they were tired as shit, and Alexander had no choice but to comply. I mean, it's not like he can fight 50,000 men on his own. He's not that much of a Chad. So on the way back, they had passed through the desert with no water, they were short on food, and many had died in a sudden monsoon flood while they were encamped. Alright, so now between 326 and 324 BC, Alexander had kicked out a third of his former satraps and executed about 6. Some were accused of extortion as well. So in spring of 324 BC, he went back to Susa, the capital of Elam, where he got hammered and told stories of his adventures while dressed as Dionysus, or the god of wine and ecstasy. So Alex had this idea of fusing the Persians and the Macedonians into a group of supermen. So in order to do this, he ordered about 80 of his officers to take Persian wives and gave generous dowries to his soldiers that married one of the native women. So yeah, there's that. So the only problem with that was his own people weren't exactly happy about all the special treatment he was giving to the assimilated Persians, be it the offices they were given, or titles of leading the companion cavalry, etc. They didn't like that their positions were being threatened, but after a mutiny, they had basically reconciled and threw a giant banquet to celebrate the ending of their misunderstanding. Apparently, in 324 BC, Greece and Asia had a mercenary problem. There were thousands of roaming mercenaries, most of which were political exiles. There was then a decree by Nicanor to Europe to take back all their exiles, and changed around some of the oligarchic regimes to allow that. Unfortunately, before Alexander could take over Nicanor's position, he died. So now, his old buddy Hephaestion had died, and Alexander threw a giant mourning party and gave his friend a royal funeral. So somewhere along the way, Alexander had become convinced he was basically a god, but he needed to hear it from other people. So being the megalomaniac he was, he got his wish, and the other cities complied. The Spartans even made fun of him through their own decree. So now, we are in Babylon, where Alexander has plans to improve the irrigation of the Euphrates River, and to get the coast of the Persian Gulf settled. But he got really sick after a prolonged bout of drinking and partying. 10 days later, he died. On June 13th, 323 BC, at the age of 33, he had ruled for 12 years and 8 months. His body was sent to Egypt to be placed in a golden coffin in Alexandria. Alright guys, well, that's been Bandana Man again with Alexander the Great. If you liked the video, let me know in the comments. Please like, subscribe, and be easy everyone. It's been Bandana Man speaking. Y'all take care. Peace.